Hello and welcome to Women in World History, the channel that believes every woman has a story the world should not forget. Today we are talking about a Scottish princess who became one of the most beloved queens of medieval England. She was born Edith, became Queen Matilda, and was remembered for generations as Good Queen Maud. Let's get into her story. Matilda was born around 1080, probably at Dunfermline in Scotland. She was the daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland and Queen Margaret, a deeply religious and highly educated English princess from the old House of Wessex. And that English bloodline is important because it explains why Matilda would later become such a valuable bride for an English king. Before the Norman conquest, England had been ruled by the House of Wessex. Then, in the early 11th century, Danish kings took over. One of the last Wessex kings to fight them was Edmund Ironside. After Edmund died in 1016, his young sons disappeared from English politics and eventually ended up on the European continent. One of those sons was Edward the Exile. He spent most of his life abroad, probably in Hungary, while England passed through the hands of Canute the Great, Canute's sons, and finally Edward the Confessor, another member of the Wessex family. Edward the Confessor had no children, so in 1057 he brought Edward the Exile back to England, apparently hoping that this lost branch of the family could solve the succession problem. And then Edward the Exile died almost immediately after coming home. He left behind a wife, Agatha, and 3 children, Edgar, Margaret, and Christina. Edgar now had one of the strongest blood claims to the English throne. After the Norman victory in 1066, some English leaders even proclaimed him king. The problem was that Edgar was young, had no army strong enough to stop William the Conqueror, and never made it to a coronation. He eventually submitted to William. His sister Margaret took a different path. She ended up in Scotland and married King Malcolm III. They had 8 children, including the princess we are talking about today. So Matilda was Scottish by birth, but through her mother, she was directly descended from the Old English royal family. To the Anglo-Saxons, that mattered a lot. Matilda was actually christened Edith, a very traditional English royal name. Later tradition says that Robert Curthose, the eldest son of William the Conqueror, stood as one of her godparents, while his mother, Matilda of Flanders, was connected with the ceremony as well. There is even a story that baby Edith grabbed at the queen's veil and pulled it over her own head, which people later treated as a sign that she would one day wear an English crown herself. Whether that little prophecy really happened or not, the crown was still a long way away. Matilda's mother, Queen Margaret, took education very seriously. She was famous for her religion, learning, charity, and attempts to bring the Scottish Church more closely in line with the practices she had known elsewhere in Europe. Her children were raised in the same atmosphere. When Matilda was still a child, she and her younger sister Mary were sent south to England to be educated under their aunt Christina, a nun. They spent time at Romsey Abbey and later at Wilton, both places where aristocratic girls could receive an excellent education. Matilda learned to read and write, knew Latin, and grew up comfortable in both English and Norman French court culture. For a woman who would later have to manage estates, correspond with bishops, sit in royal councils, and rule in her husband's absence, that education turned out to be extremely useful. But life in the convent also created the biggest problem of her young life. Her aunt Christina made Matilda wear a nun's veil. Now, wearing the veil and actually becoming a nun were not the same thing. Christina may simply have been trying to protect her nieces. Norman nobles had taken over much of England after 1066, and an unmarried girl with royal Anglo-Saxon blood could be a very attractive political prize. A veil sent a useful message. Leave this girl alone. She belongs to the church. Matilda absolutely hated it. Years later, she said that whenever her aunt was watching, she wore the veil because Christina was strict and would punish her if she refused. But the moment her aunt disappeared, Matilda would rip it off, throw it on the floor, and stomp on it. Her father was apparently no more enthusiastic about the idea. One story says Malcolm visited his daughter, saw the veil, tore it off her head, and made it very clear that he intended his daughter for marriage, not a convent. And he already had a possible husband in mind, Alan Rufus, the wealthy Lord of Richmond. Matilda was also attracting other attention. William de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, was said to have wanted to marry her. Later stories even connect her with King William Rufus, the unmarried son of William the Conqueror himself. Some versions say Rufus went to see her and found her wearing the veil, which was enough to end the idea. How much of that is true is hard to know, but the important point is that Matilda was not being raised as a future nun. Her family expected her to marry, and because of her bloodline, she could marry very well indeed. Then, everything collapsed in 1093. King Malcolm was killed during a campaign in northern England. Matilda's brother Edward died in the same battle. Queen Margaret, already seriously ill, died only a few days later. Their uncle Donald seized the Scottish throne, and Malcolm and Margaret's children suddenly found themselves caught in a succession struggle. Matilda went from being a well-connected princess with 2 living parents to an orphan whose family had been pushed out of power. Her planned marriage to Alan Rufus came to nothing. For the next several years, the exact movements of Matilda and her sister Mary are unclear. Their brothers were fighting to recover Scotland, while their uncle, Edgar the Atheling, still had connections at the English court. Eventually, with English support, Matilda's brother Edgar took the Scottish throne in 1097. So, by the end of the decade, Matilda once again had a brother wearing the Scottish crown and an uncle established among the English nobility. Then, in 1100, William Rufus died in a hunting accident in the New Forest. His younger brother Henry moved very fast. Robert Curthose, their older brother and Duke of Normandy, was away on crusade. Henry rushed to secure the royal treasury and had himself crowned King Henry I, only 3 days after Rufus died. Robert was an obvious rival, and Henry knew his new throne was not completely secure. He needed allies, he needed popularity, and most of all, he needed legitimacy. Then he looked at Matilda. Politically, she was almost perfect. Henry was the son of William the Conqueror, the man who had taken England by force in 1066. Matilda was descended from the kings who had ruled England before him. Marrying her allowed Henry to connect the Norman dynasty with the old Wessex line in 1 generation. Contemporary writers also suggest that Henry genuinely liked her. One chronicler basically gives us the medieval version of "she was not bad looking," which is not exactly great poetry, but apparently it was meant as a compliment. More importantly, writers praised her character, education, and goodness, and Henry seems to have admired her for years. So very soon after becoming king, Henry announced that he wanted to marry Edith of Scotland. And immediately, everyone remembered the veil. If Matilda had actually taken religious vows, she was a nun. If she was a nun, she could not simply leave the convent and marry a king because the king happened to want her. This was serious enough that Archbishop Anselm of Canterbury called an official church council to investigate. Matilda defended herself very clearly. She said she had never taken vows. She had never intended to become a nun. The veil had been forced on her by her aunt, and she had removed it whenever she could. Witnesses also remembered that her father wanted her married and had objected to seeing her dressed as a nun. The council accepted her story. Matilda was declared free to marry. On November 11, 1100, Edith married King Henry I at Westminster Abbey. She was crowned queen in the same ceremony and took the name Matilda, the same name as Henry's mother, Matilda of Flanders. The political message could hardly have been clearer. The son of the Norman conqueror had married a woman descended from the Old English kings. Henry had already promised at his coronation to correct some of the abuses associated with his brother's reign. His marriage added something much more emotional to that program. To many English people, Matilda made this new Norman king feel a little less foreign. And she did not disappear into the background once the wedding was over. Matilda became an active royal partner. She attended councils, issued and witnessed documents, managed a large amount of property, and acted with royal authority when Henry was away in Normandy. Westminster Abbey's own history describes her as a queen who often acted as regent during Henry's absences. That mattered because Henry spent a lot of time across the Channel dealing with Robert Curthose. Robert believed he had a better claim to England than Henry did. In 1101, the brothers came close to war before reaching the Treaty of Alton. Robert recognized Henry as king, while Henry agreed to pay him a large annual pension. Matilda actually became involved here too. A few years later, Robert gave up that pension, and one medieval account credits Matilda with persuading him to do it. Peace did not last. Henry invaded Normandy, defeated Robert at the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106, took the duchy, and kept his own brother imprisoned for the rest of Robert's life. While Henry was fighting abroad, Matilda helped keep England running. This is where she becomes much more interesting than the stereotype of a medieval queen who smiles at ceremonies, gives birth to children, and occasionally donates money to a monastery. Matilda sat in the king's council and sometimes exercised what historians describe as vice-regal authority. In other words, when Henry was gone, she could act in his place. She was also deeply involved in one of Henry's biggest arguments with the church. The issue was investiture, who had the right to appoint bishops and give them the symbols of their office. Henry wanted strong control over the English church. Pope Paschal II and Archbishop Anselm argued that kings should not control spiritual appointments that way. Henry and Anselm were both stubborn men, and the dispute became ugly enough that Anselm spent years outside England. Matilda ended up in the middle. She had known religious life since childhood, respected Anselm personally, and also had a duty to support her husband. Her surviving letters show her trying to keep communication open, pleading with Anselm, and working as an intermediary between the two sides. She did not single-handedly solve the investiture controversy, but she helped keep the relationship from collapsing completely. In 1107, a compromise was finally reached. Henry gave up the ceremony of investing bishops with the ring and staff, while bishops still owed the king homage for the lands and political privileges they held from the crown. For Matilda, being the person churchmen came to when they needed someone to talk sense into Henry became almost part of the job. And Henry was not exactly famous for being easy to talk into anything. Matilda's influence went far beyond politics. Her court became known for literature, music, religion, and scholarship. She commissioned a life of her mother, Margaret, helping shape the image that eventually turned Margaret into one of Scotland's most famous saints. Writers and poets dedicated works to Matilda, and modern scholars have called her one of the earliest major royal patrons of French literature in England. She also spent heavily on religion and charity. In 1108, she helped found Holy Trinity Priory at Aldgate in London. She supported churches, religious houses, hospitals, and care for the poor. One of the institutions traditionally connected with her was the Hospital of St. Giles outside London, created for people suffering from leprosy. And Matilda did not treat charity as something a queen did from a safe distance by handing money to priests. Stories about her describe her personally washing the feet of poor and sick people. Her younger brother David, the future King David I of Scotland, was supposedly horrified when he saw his royal sister caring for people with leprosy so closely. Matilda's answer was essentially that kings and lepers end the same way. Everyone dies. Rank does not make one human body more important than another. Whether every detail of that conversation happened exactly as later writers remembered it, the story survived because it matched the reputation Matilda already had. She was also interested in practical projects. Medieval tradition credits her with replacing a dangerous crossing of the River Lee east of London with bridges and a raised causeway. The area became associated with Bow, and later generations connected the bridge directly with good Queen Maud. So her charity was not just monasteries and prayers. It included roads, bridges, hospitals, and institutions that ordinary people actually used. That reputation gave her one of the best royal nicknames of the Middle Ages. Medieval writers praised her as Matilda the Good Queen, and English tradition remembered her as Good Queen Maud. And while she was busy governing, negotiating with churchmen, commissioning books, and funding public works, she also did the one job a medieval queen absolutely could not ignore: producing legitimate heirs. Henry and Matilda had at least 2 children who survived infancy. Their daughter Matilda was born in 1102. Their son, William Adelin, followed in 1103. And then they stopped. That is interesting because Henry I was definitely not infertile. He had a spectacular number of illegitimate children, probably more than 20, with several different women. Yet with Queen Matilda, he had only 1 surviving son and 1 surviving daughter. Historians cannot tell us why. Maybe there were pregnancies or children that did not survive and were poorly recorded. Maybe the couple spent too much time apart. Maybe Matilda's health changed. Medieval writers and later storytellers came up with all kinds of explanations, including the rather nasty suggestion that Henry became less interested in sleeping with her because of how closely she worked with people suffering from leprosy. There is no way to prove that, and it may simply be gossip. Whatever happened privately, Henry clearly trusted Matilda politically. She remained influential, and there is no sign that her husband's many affairs pushed her out of royal life. Their daughter soon became useful in international politics too. When the German king Henry V wanted a marriage alliance with England, negotiations began for little Princess Matilda. The match was enormous for Henry I. His father had been mocked for being born outside marriage. Now, Henry's daughter was being promised to one of the most important rulers in Europe. The princess left England for Germany in 1110, where she was about 8 years old. She would later marry Henry V and become known to history as Empress Matilda. For Queen Matilda of Scotland, that departure was probably the last time she ever saw her daughter. Her son William was also prepared for a major political marriage. Henry arranged a match between William and Matilda of Anjou, daughter of Count Fulk. Anjou bordered Normandy, and an alliance with the family could help protect Henry's continental lands from enemies in France. Fulk himself would later become King of Jerusalem. By the late 1110s, Queen Matilda had done almost everything expected of a medieval queen. She had given Henry a son and a daughter. She had helped connect the Norman and Anglo-Saxon royal lines. She had governed in his absence, mediated with the church, supported literature, funded religious houses, cared for the sick, and built a reputation strong enough to survive for centuries. Then, on May 1st, 1118, Matilda died. She was only around 38 years old. A chronicle from Holy Trinity later claimed that she had wanted to be buried there, at the house she had supported so generously. Instead, she was buried at Westminster Abbey, close to the shrine of Edward the Confessor, a fitting resting place for a queen whose own bloodline reached back to the Old English royal family. Henry did not remarry immediately. Then disaster struck in 1120. William Adelin, the couple's only surviving legitimate son, drowned in the White Ship disaster while crossing the English Channel. Suddenly, Henry had no legitimate male heir. In 1121, he married Adeliza of Louvain, hoping for another son. None came. That meant the future of England now depended on the daughter Matilda had sent away to Germany as a child. After Emperor Henry V died in 1125, Empress Matilda returned to her father's world. Henry I eventually named her as his heir and arranged her second marriage to Geoffrey of Anjou. When Henry died in 1135, however, Empress Matilda did not simply walk into Westminster and put on the crown. Her cousin, Stephen of Blois, moved faster, crossed to England, and had himself crowned king. The result was the long civil war remembered as the Anarchy. And strangely enough, the old argument over Queen Matilda's convent veil came back from the dead. During the struggle, Stephen's supporters argued at one point that Queen Matilda of Scotland had really been a nun, which would make her marriage to Henry invalid and their daughter illegitimate. The argument did not settle the succession, but it shows just how important that childhood veil had become. Something her aunt forced onto her as a girl was still being used in a battle over the English crown decades after her death. Empress Matilda never became crowned Queen of England, but her son did. In 1154, he succeeded King Stephen as Henry II, beginning the Plantagenet dynasty. So in the end, Matilda of Scotland's bloodline did exactly what Henry I's marriage was meant to do. The descendants of William the Conqueror and the old kings of Wessex were joined together, and their grandson inherited England. Matilda herself never fought a war for the throne. She never led an army. Her story is quieter than the story of the daughter who came after her. But during 18 years as queen, she built a different kind of power. Through family, government, religion, charity, culture, and the ability to make herself useful to almost everyone around the king. That is why medieval England remembered her not simply as Henry I's wife, but as Good Queen Maud. So what do you think? Why do you think Henry and Matilda had only 2 children who survived, even though Henry had so many children outside the marriage? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Women in World History, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. For today, goodbye!